In Syria, Christmas celebrations generally begin with some remembrance of previous days when it was impossible to openly worship Jesus, with ceremonies involving reflection on those days. Christians there now are wondering whether or not they are going to once more be driven underground. Previously, there has been under the dictatorship of Bashar al-Assad, and before him his father Hafez, at least an allowance of certain church groups to function normally. But with Islamist jihadi groups taking over, there's very real concern that the ongoing persecution of Christians that has been, even under the Assads, will only worsen. I'm Reagan King, and joined as always by my good friend and co-host to discuss Syria. Alistair, good evening.
Good evening. Good to be here again. Another nation which has seen so many changes so quickly. I was amazed watching back at what happened in Syria, how fast things changed. The picture, I mean, I've been talking about this to other people. The map of the Middle East is both geographically and politically changing minute by minute practically, and certainly the speed at which the Assad regime was removed. I mean, they'd been in control, literally in control as kind of tyrants over Syria for 50 years when you take his father and then Bashar, who took over from his father at his death. But it goes to show when God's moving upon a nation for things to change, things happen fast. But as often happens with these turning around in a nation, you have to pray that what comes next is better than what was there before, because very often, as we've seen in our own lifetime, the second regime tends to be worse than the first. But that's why we are making these things known to all our viewers, because as the Bible tells us, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and turn from their wicked ways, seek his face and turn from their wicked ways, God hears from heaven and heals the land. So we're not only talking about our own lands, we're talking about nations that are under oppression, because that's what was going on in Syria. They were an oppressed people, and certainly it was tough for Christianity. The persecuted church was suffering. There was parts of it that were kind of accepted, but they were definitely under the control of the regime. So it's a very important time for us to be aware of what's going on.
On Christmas Eve, the outer gates of the homes of Syrian Christians are locked as a reminder of the years of persecution when all worship had to be hidden. And the families will carry lit candles and prepare a bonfire in their respective courtyards. The youngest in the family will read the gospel story of the Nativity as the father lights the bonfire, with others gathering round to discuss, to sing psalms, and to reflect on the Christmas message prior to a public service, which others gather around a bonfire in the center of churchyards across the country. But while these customs have endured for some time and have to some extent been allowed under the Assad regime, it has been the case that a conglomerate of differing rebel groups have joined together to topple Bashar al-Assad and the regime that has seen hundreds of thousands die in a brutal and bloody civil war over the past 15 or so years. It's important that we recognize, Alistair, the plight, the mixed feelings that Christians will be having about this. Many were coerced to support Assad in name and will be fearing reprisals by Islamist jihadis. They should never have given their vocal support to the Assad regime in the first place in those cases. Others, perhaps who have been outspoken critics, might be thinking, well, actually, there's opportunity here. This is a blessing that Assad has been toppled. Many are feeling that, but are simultaneously and rightly concerned that they could be about to go from the frying pan into the fire, so to speak.
I mean, this is the thing, isn't it? With this new regime, as you said, they are kind of divided. But the one thing that unites them is their kind of desire to topple Christianity, and of course the main thing that unites them is their hatred of Israel and wanting to see Israel taken off the map. So for Christians who are still living there, they must be certainly thinking and asking the Lord, do we stay and fight from within? Because obviously we're called to be witnesses to the ends of the earth, even in the most radically opposing nations that have Islamic thinking. Or is it time to move on and keep safe?
It's important to understand the nature of how much Christianity has declined in Syria. In 2011, prior to the Syrian civil war, there were some 1.5 million estimated to profess to follow Jesus. That was about 10% of the population. The number has since dropped sharply, with only around 300,000 believed to remain in the country today. Now, this is a common trend across the Middle East, with the exception of Israel, where actually the number of Christians is increasing, both among Jewish and Arab communities. A century ago, Christians in the Middle East comprised 20% of the total population, but today, no more than 3 to 4% of the entire region's population, according to the Pew Research Center 2015 survey. The drastic decline in the number of Christians in the Middle East is considered to be part of a longer-term exodus compounded by varying persecutions against Christians in that region, Syria included. Now, in 2016, there were various political bodies that recognized the atrocities, particularly of the militant Islamic group ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, which had its headquarters in Raqqa in Syria predominantly. And this had massive, catastrophic impact on the Christian community there.
Yeah, definitely. That was a terrifying time for the Christians in Syria and across the Middle East. As you see, the numbers are decreasing rapidly in very short time. And yet we are called to be light, salt and light in all the nations of the earth. But it is because of the violence. I mean, I was brought up in an Islamic nation in Pakistan as a boy. I was born there and lived there till I was 12 years old. And we lived relatively safely amongst the Christian communities. But I was talking about this to a friend because I didn't realize that at the time, but we always lived in walled communities, and that just became normal life for us. But as I was towards the end, before we returned to the UK, the persecution was getting stronger. There was more and more violence against Christians in the nation, and certainly if we was to stay on there, to get a job in an Islamic nation would have been very impossible, or you'd be living at a low level. And you see this right across the Islamic nations in the Middle East too, that there's a rapid violence coming against Christians so that they have to move, or some of them even get imprisoned and never come out. So you can see what the problems are.
Absolutely. And one of the mistakes I think that people make and are making is looking at this and kind of painting a wonderful picture of what life was like for Christians under Assad, when it quite frankly was not particularly wonderful. I'm seeing very bizarre commentary from individuals who in many cases have zero experience of presence or of life in any frame of time in the Middle East, saying that Christians were free under Assad, and that this is all a plot to destroy Christianity in Syria, which is really, frankly, a disgusting conspiracy theory. A lot of people are saying that Israel is behind this. Bizarrely, Israel is partnering apparently with people who have pledged its own downfall. They're saying they're going after Jerusalem next. But all of this is just highlighting the confusion that reigns over this particular conflict, and has done for some years. President Assad, who has connections with the Iranian regime. He was propped up by the Iranian regime, propped up by Hezbollah, propped up by Russia, has seen a worrying for him decrease in his ability to know security, because Russia has been otherwise occupied with its illegal invasion of Ukraine. It still has troops, and its horrendous militia group Wagner is still there in Syria, although desperately, I'm sure, trying to get out at the moment. You also have had members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard there. They have similarly otherwise been occupied in recent days. Catastrophic failures in the regime this year in its onslaughts against Israel, distracted by the failures of Hamas and its proxy army Hezbollah, which previously also had a significant number of troops aiding Assad in Syria, withdrawn to aid in its ongoing conflict. Recently entered into a very tenuous ceasefire with Israel. And so seeing this, the rebels have clearly planned, they've been bolstering their resources, and they have seized their moment. But it's important to note that under Assad, chemical weapons used against his own people, Christians who did speak against his atrocities disappeared, as any other opponents were. Others coerced into expressing some form of tenuous support. And between 2011 and 2019, the statistics clearly show that 61% of churches damaged in the Syrian civil war were actually targeted by pro-regime forces, not by Islamists, not by ISIS. 124 documented incidents of violence against Christian religious centers, note not just individual Christians, which far exceed that. Between 2011 and 2019 saw 75 of those attacks perpetrated by forces loyal to Assad, and 33 by various factions of the opposition, particularly ISIS.
So yeah, the statistics and the facts and figures are very clear. That life under the regime, Assad regime, wasn't great for Christians, and you know, you mentioned it there, that some of them who spoke against or stood up, they not even necessarily spoke against, were just confronting what was going on. They disappeared. The chances are they were either put into prisons or were killed. Part of the various, I mean, the numbers of people that were killed under the regime, you know, they're hundreds of thousands, they're huge numbers, and yet the world remained fairly silent about it. And the Christians have survived, but they've survived under, as you say, real control, and more or less having to bow down to the authority of the Assad regime. But the interesting thing was how quickly it all changed, and it just showed how they were dependent, as you say, on Iran, on Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Russians. And as soon as the Russians said, well, we're not getting involved in this, within a week, everything turned around in the nation. So it's quite amazing how quickly things can turn.
There are some reports that speculate that Christians across Syria may be unable to partake in public ceremonies and celebrations of Christmas. That is something that is being looked into and debated. Not all sources are in agreement on that. However, definitely this is a day of uncertainty for believers who are there. CBN has more.
While the leader of the main faction of Syria's rebel forces is pledging no new war, a democratic enclave in northeast Syria that's home to Kurds, Yazidis, and Christians is being attacked by a proxy army of Turkey. CBN News spoke with a Christian from northeast Syria by phone. To protect his identity, we've disguised his voice and can't show his face. We're calling him Gabriel.
So, yeah, we are under attack. And we don't think that Erdogan and his proxies are going to stop in this place in the north.
The autonomous administration in northeast Syria is unique in all of the Middle East. CBN News reported on this new government back in this 2019 report.
It's completely new in the Middle East, and I'd say it's completely new in the whole world.
Freelance journalist Carlos Zurituza has covered this new government for several years.
What these people are actually doing is rebuilding themselves, starting from scratch after decades of repression by the Assad regime. So literally from day one, since 2012, since they liberated their territories, that they have in the process of reconstructing civil society, integrating different components in the region, not just Kurds, it's Arabs, Armenians, Syriacs.
During the war to defeat ISIS, the autonomous administration partnered with the U.S. and allied forces.
They are more similar in human rights to what we believe in the West, and critically, they have freedom of religion and belief and an overrepresentation of religious minorities. So what's happened is they stand in direct opposition to these jihadi Islamist groups, HTS and SNA. And so today we are seeing the SNA is being used as the militia to break down and attack northeast Syria.
The autonomous administration fears the Turkish government of President Erdogan, who has stated his intention to defeat the Kurds of northeast Syria. Given the attacks by Turkish-backed forces and Erdogan's threats, the people of northeast Syria are calling out to the U.S., the West, and the Christian world for help.
We call on all the Christians in the world to call their nations and brothers and sisters in their administration to make the Christian, the Kurds and Druze and all the minorities to be able to protect themselves from these kind of atrocities.
Gabriel says northeast Syria is not asking for foreign troops, but for the resources to defend themselves.
Especially the Trump administration and the Israeli government to make this happen, because Christians all over Syria, Christians all over Lebanon, all over Iraq, they want to survive.
Heading believes it's important to pray for this fledgling Middle East democracy.
Because in this area, you have people who can believe whatever they want. Christians, Yazidis, even Muslim background believers who have come to faith in Jesus are able to practice their religion in this area. So pray for northeast Syria, that it'll remain stable and that the international community would stand and back northeast Syria against these Islamist jihadis.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
A very good report there from CBN again, from our friends there. Yes, so important for us to realize that the nation is still in chaos and will be for a while. We pray, as we were urged to do on that report, pray for stability for the Christians, particularly in the northern areas of Syria, but right across the nation where they're scattered and living in difficult situations. But you can see from that report that Turkey is a major player in this whole situation, and there's no doubt that they were supporting this rebel group. They referred to as a rebel group, and helping them through, allowing them to come in through the northern borders there and take control of the nation and turn things around very fast. But we are always aware that what comes in next is so important, and for us as believers, we need to be praying strong for stability and for strength for our brothers and sisters, the believers there, and restoration, that they're able to continue to their practice of worship in Syria. But it's changing fast, so we really got to be prayerful and watching and praying.
Freedom may be stripped away. Yeah. If it was ever really and truly there, especially for evangelical, born-again followers of Jesus. And yet there are those who, even though the freedom to practice certain things may be stripped away en masse, they will continue to serve and they will continue to stand firm on the promises of Christ, and will continue to be an example to you and me and each of our viewers and everyone who is part of the body of Christ around the world. I'm so encouraged when I read and hear of the stories of our friends at Help the Persecuted and people who serve alongside them. And there's just some wonderful testimony of continued faithfulness in very real trial. Here's with thanks to our friends at Help the Persecuted.
With the sudden takeover of Syria by Islamist rebels driving out Syrian President Bashar Assad and his regime, there's renewed hope for the end of the brutal civil war. But Christians are now in an increasingly uncertain and perilous situation. Before this offensive began, Syria was home to an estimated 300,000 Christians. But the takeover by jihadist forces has the Christian community concerned that they're being taken back to the time when Jabhat al-Nusra desecrated Christian churches and imposed Islamic Sharia law. While some fled the conflict, the majority of Christians had no resources to leave and are facing a major lack of access to essentials, including food, water and electricity. In the midst of this crisis, we're standing with the persecuted Christians, as one of our on-the-ground field ministers, Daniel, explains.
It's okay for me. I am not afraid because I know that God is with me, protect me, and if I died also for God, it's very okay for me. I am brave with that, and I will go back and I will try to work there. So pray for me that I can work normally, I can see the people normally and help them.
Daniel, who had to temporarily leave his hometown, is urging prayer and support so that he can return as soon as possible to continue ministering to persecuted believers, even if it means risking his life. So what does this takeover mean for the long-term future for the region? Our CEO, Joshua Youssef, shares his perspective.
A lot of fear about whether or not these rebel groups will rightly judge and rightly govern with Christians and other minorities in country. So I would say there's a lot of mixed emotions. Is this going to allow for a flourishing of Syria, where you have all these different groups, Druze and Christians and Muslims, all working and governing together? Or does this turn out like Libya? Or does this turn out like Iraq when ISIS came in through the northern part of that country and wreaked havoc on Christians? And so that's what we don't know right now.
In the midst of this upheaval, we plan to expand our work in Syria to rescue, restore and rebuild the lives of many more persecuted Christians, enabling the church to not only endure but flourish and multiply. Please prayerfully consider giving to help our on-the-ground field ministers in Syria rescue, restore and rebuild the lives of persecuted Christians who've been swept up in the conflict. You can do so at htp.org/donate.
What cannot be lost in this discussion on the persecuted church in Syria is the reality of confusion and complexity, not just in any Middle Eastern conflict, but in this one in particular. The rebel grouping is not just one homogeneous unit of united fighters against an evil regime. This is a grouping of at least 9 completely different organizations that chose to coordinate their attacks against Bashar al-Assad and see him overthrown. Each region of Syria, though, continues to some degree, have varying levels of prominence of rule by these different groupings. ISIS is still in Syria and is still heavily involved. Of course, with its roots in Al-Qaeda, has significant influence also in this present government as the new de facto, we'll say interim leader, because this is an ongoing situation, is connected to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, whose leader was and has roots in Al-Qaeda. So all of this is wrapped up in together. We have another group, Ahrar al-Sham, which was founded in 2011. Its primary goal was also to establish a Sunni Islamic government. It has collaborated with other opposition groups quite a bit, but has been weakened by internal splits and clashes with HTS, but is still very active in parts of northern Syria. There's Harakat Nur al-Din al-Zinkai, which is now Islamist, though it started out more moderate, so to speak. And while it is technically defunct as of 2019 after internal losses and battles with HTS, its former members are still around. You also have Ansar al-Islam, which operates primarily in Kurdish regions, the Turkestan Islamic Party, TIP, founded interestingly by Uyghurs, that group that is known to be in China also, Uyghur militants with roots there in Xinjiang, China. They fought against the Assad regime. They support global jihad. Jund al-Aqsa, Islamic Front, Ansar al-Tawhid, all of these groups are Islamist jihadi supporting groups, some of them adopting a very extreme form of jihadism, the Salafi sect of Sunni Islam, which is very keen on imposing Sharia law. There's not going to be much room for open practice of following Jesus if they come to the forefront.
Yeah, I think without a doubt they saw the strategically that they needed to join together, because they saw the weakness of the regime, the Assad regime, so dependent on Russia, on Iran, on Hezbollah, and this was a time for them to unite in order to bring down or depose this regime completely. But you know, the strength of being united temporarily is going to potentially be their weakness in the future, because there's no doubt each one of those 9 different groups have a leader, all of them wanting to be the leader, the overall leader. So, you know, as the Bible tells us, you know, a house divided against itself will surely fall, and a nation divided against itself will fall into ruins. So, you know, in some ways, this deposing of a regime which was very controlling of the whole of the nation, but dependent on support from outside of the nation, has come apart. And now we will, I mean, that's a great way to pray in the future, is that in some way these people who are united at the moment will divide against each other. And a little bit like the story in 2 Chronicles 20 of Jehoshaphat, when he had the enemies come against him and he called a fast and prayed. What happened? The enemies started to fight one another, and he just saw the victory and didn't even have to fight the battle. All he did was worship the Lord. So it's exciting in some ways, it's sad in other ways, but you know that God is in control, and he hasn't taken his hand off the Middle East.
All may not be calm, all may not be bright in Syria, but those who truly know the Lord Jesus can know that Jesus Christ came into this world of sin, suffering, shame, this world filled with war and rumors of war, so that we might see death, sin, and all of its consequences destroyed once and for all. Your redemption is nigh. Continue to trust in Jesus and continue to rejoice in that beauty of the Savior born into this dark world to be the light of the world.